Special guest in conversation this week. Oh, it's been a long time coming. How our paths have not crossed before now is totally beyond me. Being one of those people who loves musical theatre and only ever read his name in programmes, I remember thinking, I wonder what he's like to meet. And then Nick Ferrari said that he'd had lunch with him in the south of France, and he said, oh, he's got some great stories. I said, well, he better have. His book's The Weight of the Bible. I've never seen anything like it. This is a sort of a biography of a man behind so many songs and so many musicals that I'm surprised we've only got one volume. I thought there would have been actually two by now, Leslie Bricusse.
There may be two.
There may be two. Do you have enough material for two?
Oh, I have enough material for 10.
For 10. The thing I was impressed with is that lots of nice people have said nice things as forewords to you because you know a lot of people.
Well, I've been in the business a long time, and I've had an amazing diversity of friends because, people like Elton John, who is not really my world, but he was born in Pinner, as I was, or we lived in Pinner as children. We went to the same school.
Oh, did you?
So we have quite a lot in common.
And he wrote very nice things about you, because in terms of writing, you're up there with the greats. You're up there with all the people because you've got a track record. But it wasn't always like that, was it?
Well, I started at university, so I started writing then. I had an amazing piece of good luck. I realized when I was doing my national service that I wanted to write songs. I'd always been enthralled by Cole Porter and the Gershwins, and I studied their work a great deal. And of course at Cambridge I got the chance to indulge that because of a thing called the Footlights Club. And
the famous Footlights.
The famous Footlights. And we brought the first Footlights ever to come to the West End, mainly because, it was a very good show, but particularly because in it was Jonathan Miller. And Jonathan Miller became one of the Beyond the Fringe boys, and just his first sketch in the University Review was A Day in the Life of the BBC. Was absolutely hilarious. Anyway, we came to London, and our show was called Out of the Blue, and out of the blue at the first night came a wonderful old lady star called Beatrice Lillie. She saw the first night. And the next day, I'm down from Cambridge one day, right? I got a call from her. Her leading man on her Broadway review could not come to England because he owed an ex-wife 28 years back alimony, which was a good reason not to come to England.
Seems fair enough.
And I got the gig, and so we opened at the Globe Theatre, and I was off to the races. I was very lucky.
A very happy boy.
I was 23, and that was very nice.
Did you think that would last? Did you think of that in terms of starting a career, or did you just think, well, this will do until I find something that I
I never wanted
better?
to be a performer. That was not on my list. But it was a great opportunity, and then the agent that negotiated my deal, I was all set up with an agent the next day. He also represented Max Bygraves. And I got to do Max's first film. I wrote the screenplay and the score, so it was just a coming together. I called it the Department of Fate, who decides these things. And I just went for the ride, and I was lucky.
The people then started knocking at your door because all of a sudden you have a name and people know what you can do.
I don't think it was so much that, because I then went into a sort of fallow period where I wasn't quite sure where to go next. I knew Auntie B, as we called her, invited me to go back to America with her. And it's very strange because her son, she was in private life, she was Lady Peel, Sir Robert Peel, Prime Minister in 1840. And there had been 5 or 6 Sir Robert Peels. And the youngest one, her son, she married a Sir Robert Peel, and her son was killed in the war. And I was exactly the age that he was when he was killed. So she had sort of adopted me, and she was a wonderful woman, absolutely brilliantly funny. And she became very much a part of my life. I mean, I had a lovely mum anyway, but this Auntie B was the sort of magical figure. And I then met Evie, my wife, and Auntie B approved of her. And we did all sorts of wonderful things together. So I didn't go back to America with her because I thought that's going to protract my being a performer, which I didn't want. So I had then to figure out what I was going to do as a writer. And that came along when I met Tony Newley. And that was a very good combination, because to have your partner be a well-known performer was very handy. The only trouble with that was that if your partner's a performer and you get a successful show, he's tied up for 12 months or 18 months. But we had a wonderful time.
I interviewed him. I loved him to pieces years and years ago when we were in another building, and he came. I just remember thinking, it's Tony Newley. It's Tony Newley.
Today is his birthday.
Today's his birthday. How wonderful. He passed over some time ago now.
17 years.
Is it really 17 years? But you had this fantastic working relationship. But I always question songwriters and lyricists, because I don't understand how it works.
Well, nor did we.
That was why I'm so good.
We talked for about 18 months about what we were going to write, and the first show we wrote was called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. Yeah. And we wrote it in Auntie B's apartment in New York, because I was due to go back there with her to work on something that she wanted to do. And Tony called me up and said, Bernie Delfont's given me a theatre in Brighton, and I'm going to do a show with 10 girls. I said, of course you are. And I don't know what to do. So it'll be songs and stuff. And I said, I can't come. I'm going to New York tomorrow with Auntie B. So that was it. I hung up the phone, and Evie, my wife, said, that was a mistake. Call him back and tell him to come with us. I said, well, he's not going to come tomorrow morning. Anyway, he did. And we wrote Stop the World in 3 weeks in Auntie B's apartment. And I worked with her in the morning, and Tony starting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon till midnight for these 3 weeks. The interesting thing is that we had never, ever written a song. We just knew we could. I don't know what instinct about us. We never discussed it. And we wrote the book in 14 days. We had 8 days left to write a score, and we wrote 14 songs in 8 days. I've still got the piece of paper with Once in a Lifetime on one side of it and What Kind of Fool Am I on the other, because we had to press harder and harder as the days ran away from us. And that was how we started.
Wow. Fancy keeping the paper. I'm more impressed by keeping the paper. But you've still got things, because you tend to find that lyricists have bottom drawers, that they have an idea and they think, oh, it doesn't work at the moment, I'll save it for another time.
No, I've kept all the stuff.
Everything.
Unlike Elton, who has little pieces of paper from Bernie Taupin and writes that way. But anyway, we had no idea it would work. But Tony directed the show and started it and co-wrote it. And what he did in the 4 weeks that I then stayed in New York, by the time I got back here, he had it up and running. It was just amazing. I don't think anybody could do that many jobs and do them well as he did that time.
Look, I said at the beginning of the interview that the book is enormous. I mean, even by most sort of biographies and autobiographies nowadays, it's got a lot of words in it, ladies and gentlemen, because there's a lot of water flowed under the bridge. There's a lot of famous people that you've written for. There's a lot of hit songs. There's a lot of awards along the way. I mean, you're a very, 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 very successful person. But
that was 4 or 5 varies, I think.
I think there was quite a few. but yet you're still a very modest person.
I have a lot to be modest about.
but you just had an ability to find a song. So when we did, we laughed in the office earlier about My Old Man's a Dustman for some reason. I don't know why we laughed about it. But then because we went from that, and then somebody said, quite a young junior member of staff, what does he write? I said, he wrote Candyman. They went, he wrote Candyman? I said, yes. I went, wow. Well, that takes him to a new level, you see. So in one hand, we can dismiss the Dustman. The second man, up comes the Candyman, which, of course, was a hit for Sammy Davis Jr.
Yes, that was a very unexpected hit, because the man who recorded it, Sammy's recording manager at that time, he just joined that label. And Frank Sinatra had just had a hit with a song called High Hopes, which was a sort of children's sing-along.
Is that the one? We've got high hopes.
That's right. Sammy Cahn and Jimmy Van Heusen wrote it. And that was his thinking, that if he had a sort of sing-along song, it might work. And it took weeks and weeks and weeks to get to number one. Sammy would call us everywhere and say, it's number 4, it's number 3. And it was a massive hit, which was the only number one song he ever had, so it was very nice. It was not, that was in Willy Wonka, it was not my favourite song. My favourite song is Pure Imagination.
Yes.
That's so much.
Which I think is the one that everybody remembers. They remember that. You see, whereas I did love Candyman because I thought it was just great. But I don't know for you, what is the appealing piece about the song? Is it when it's finally finished, or is it going, oh, I'm so glad that line's the best. That's a really super line there. That really works.
Well, I think, you follow the line of the song, and if you get a felicitous rhyme, that's always pleasing, and it's just a joy to do. I don't particularly love one song more than another, but when you've written over 1,000 of them, as I have over the years, you realise in retrospect what are your favourite songs, and that's what I do.
And some songs you might have thought at the end, this is going to be an absolute smash, and didn't do anything.
I never think in those terms. I think in terms of, does it fit the context? I have anybody who writes musicals has the great advantage of people who just write pop songs, in that you know what it has to be about, because every song has a context. You're at a given position in the play where something has to happen, and what he's going to say, you know up front what he's going to say. A pop song, I used to write a few songs like that, but that wasn't a pleasure for me. So the context song in a musical is much more interesting.
And have the musicals changed over the years from when you first started writing? Do you keep up to date with what goes on in the West End and around the world?
Oh yes, we saw Kinky Boots last week.
What did you think?
Well, it was wonderful. I mean, Jerry Mitchell, who directed and choreographed it, was our choreographer some 15 years ago, more 20, on a show called Jekyll and Hyde, which has not yet been here, but and it's wonderful to see people you knew way back when suddenly break through.
Yes.
And now Jerry's gone back to America and he's doing 2 more musicals this season, so he's become really hot.
Good. Listen, very, very quick break. More from Leslie Bricusse and Pure Imagination after this. Special guest in conversation this week, Pure Imagination, the Salter biography by Leslie Bricusse, who must have sat down. Did you dictate this to somebody, Leslie? Did you sit down, or did you record it yourself and then give it to them and say, listen, you sort it?
I have the leather-bound, handwritten copy.
Handwritten?
At home, yes.
Wow. You are good at keeping things, aren't you?
Oh, yes, I'm a great archivist.
Hoarder, they would say. People hoard things.
Not a hoarder.
Oh, okay, an archivist. Okay.
Sounds better.
So did somebody come to you and say, listen, it's about time you started putting things down in print for us?
Well, I said that to myself, of course. You reach a certain age and you think, I've got to tell some of these stories. So I just did it in odd moments, spread over a lot of months, and finally got a book out of it, which is good.
It's also very it's a great experience for you, because once you go down a particular train of thought, it jogs your mind and you go, oh, I remember that now, because you're very good on your recollections, very good.
Well, I have a pretty good memory, and from an early age there were sort of various salient things that I remember in my life which took me on to the next stage. And that makes it easier to remember. And of course, growing up in the war made it easier to remember too.
Yes.
Very significant that was.
Was it easier to be a songwriter in those days than it is now? Do you think now it's more difficult for people trying to break into the business?
I think it probably was easier then, because I think the competition now is for, the songs are all about getting to number one. It wasn't like that in the early days. I mean, people just were songwriters. At the top level, you had Cole Porter and Rodgers and Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hart before that, and the Gershwins, and they just wrote beautiful things. But they were all show writers.
Yes.
All their big songs came out of shows. They were everything had a context. And Cole Porter, whom I was fortunate enough to meet, he was one of Auntie Bee's friends. and she took me over to a hospital called the Harkness Pavilion, and without telling me I was going to meet Cole Porter, and introduced me, and I nearly died. And he gave me the Cole Porter songbook inscribed by him, which was wonderful. And there was a man, he had a very bad riding accident when he was a young man. He had endless operations, and yet still managed to write these gorgeous songs. He would take a yacht. He was a very wealthy man. He would charter a yacht and hang it with a dozen Impressionist paintings and go off, take a bunch of friends. It was rather like the Algonquin Round Table sort of thing. And it indeed included members of the Algonquin Table. And he'd come back 6 weeks later after a lovely cruise and a new score.
Makes it sound so easy, but I'm sure it's far more complicated than that.
Pretty classy way to do it.
Pretty classy way to do it. Sammy Davis Jr., of course. Now, there could be a show. We think there's definitely going to be a show next year featuring the songs.
Well, it isn't just the songs. Sammy obviously was a very close friend, and we knew him for a long time. And when he left us, 1990 he died. Quincy Jones, who's a pal of ours, said, "We've got to do this." And it never had occurred to me then, because Sammy had been alive and he'd been very much around. And it was Quincy's idea that we do it. And he spent 2 summers with us in France. We didn't do much writing, but we had a lot of fun. And out of it came the idea for the book. And then I went on my own and wrote the score. And I used, because they fitted the context, I used about 8 songs that I had written with Tony Newley, because the 3 of us were great pals. And then I wrote about 16 other songs for the context of the book to tell Sammy's life story, because it was a pretty rough life. He went out on the road, imagine, at 3.
Yes.
He was performing at 3. There's film footage on him at that age doing incredible tap dance routines. And he was largely sponsored by Bill Bojangles Robinson. The famous song of Sammy's called Mr. Bojangles. And he was in with his dad and uncle. They were the Will Mastin Trio, they were called, with this little boy, and he grew up on the road. He never spent one day in school, not one day, and for which he resented them, but they took care of him, and he was self-educated, totally self-educated. He had this amazing career, the performer's performer.
It's interesting. I remember him singing Mr. Bojangles, and I remember thinking it was one of those mesmerising songs for me. You just sit there and the way that he sold a song. But then if he was performing from the age of 3, he learnt the hard way. He went to the School of Hard Knocks.
Well, his performance of Mr. Bojangles was the most complete performance of a song, and an acting performance that I've ever seen. One song, that was his masterpiece.
Yes.
Absolutely wonderful.
And is that something you can teach somebody?
No, I don't think that.
You have to have it, don't you?
Yes, I don't see how anyone could do that. And Evie and I saw it. We saw Sammy perform about 500 times, and every time he sang Mr. Bojangles, we said to each other, "That's the best he's ever done it." And every time it was the best. It just was.
He was just a brilliant performer. I'd love to have met him.
Oh, he was wonderful. We were very lucky. Again, coincidence and the Department of Fate. We opened at the Queen's Theatre here in London, Stop the World. And a week later, he opened at the Prince of Wales down the road. So he had 1 week, and he came and saw our show on the first night. We went out to dinner afterwards. And every other night after that, we just went out and talked and became instant pals.
What do you talk about? What do you talk about to somebody like that?
Well, I mean, with Sammy, Motormouth, it was just wonderfully funny. We kind of jogged each other. The conversation was always hilariously funny. Sammy, of course, always had an entourage with him. I mean, he said, "Let's go and have a quiet dinner." I booked a table for 18 at the White Elephant.
Oh, lovely.
And his great entourage of friends would come in. But it was always electric and dynamite.
It's different now, show business, isn't it? It seems to have changed. I think the world's moved fairly fast. I'm glad to see that the West End's in a reasonably healthy state.
Well, there are over 20 musicals, I think, in town right now.
It's almost like a resurgence, isn't it? People are saying, go to see a musical. I mean, we've still got the Les Miserables, we've still got Phantom running.
I had lunch with Cameron Mackintosh yesterday, and we went.
My God, you're good at name dropping.
We went into the Queen's Theatre because he wanted me to see it, and he took a picture of me sitting with my wife, where Tony Newley and I wrote our second show up in the window.
Oh, you can look
Avenue.
down, yes.
And there were people at the box office, and he said, every performance, there are people at the box office. It reminded me of a line that David Merrick, the producer of Stop the World, said. He took us at the Schubert Theatre in New York, took us out to see the people lined up along the wall. He said, that's the one line I don't want cut from the show.
What a fantastic life! What an amazing life! The people that you've met through your talent, the people that you have so much in common with them. As I said, you look at the beginning of the book, and Julie Andrews writes so nice about you. Elton's done some lovely stuff about you. Even the late Brian Forbes did some lovely things.
Well, Forbes was our dearest friend, and of course it was through Forbes that we met Elton, because he lived in Wentworth in Surrey, where they lived, and he bought a house just along the street from them called Hercules.
That's right, yes.
That's his middle name,
yes.
Elton Hercules John. And he was in awe and in love with the Forbes family, which is easy to be. We are too. And for many years, that was the nucleus of that group.
So who's? I mean, we heard. I was saying earlier on to Leslie that Nick Ferrari went out for lunch with Gloria Hunniford and yourself. And have you known Gloria for a long time?
Oh yes, 30 years.
30 years. How did you meet? Did you meet on her radio program?
I met her on a radio show. Yes.
Right.
And I used to take mates in there. I went in. I didn't tell her, but I went in one day with Sammy and Liza Minnelli, and that was. She was drooling. She was so wonderful.
Oh, how wonderful! How wonderful! Of course, Liza just cancelled her 2 dates over here.
I know, it's very sad.
Which I was very sad about.
And people were.
Yes, I was hoping. You have a show running at the moment, though, don't you, at the St James Theatre called Pure Imagination?
Yes, that's just a collection of songs, my favourite songs, which we do about 50 of them in 2 hours, and
just 50.
And they said, why aren't you doing dialogue? And I said, well, every bit of dialogue is 2 songs, so I'd sooner let the songs speak. You don't need to talk about them. You either like them or you don't like them.
They do like. You've got Dave Willits in this,
Dave
of
Willits,
course.
yes, lovely guy.
Lovely Dave.
He's a really sweet man.
Yes, and then hopefully next year, because I mean, you just don't seem to stop, do you? Really, there's always something going on in your life.
Well, thank God.
Could you ever see yourself just settling back? Go, that's it. I'm just going to retire. No, well, you're in a business where you don't retire, aren't you?
No, when you die, you retire.
That's right. That's how it works nowadays. And then hopefully the Sammy show will come off next year.
Well, I pray.
You found somebody.
We did the show originally in California, in San Diego, at a place called the Old Globe Theatre in a beautiful park. And someone that Sammy had introduced us to as the next me, a gentleman who rejoiced in the name of Oba Babatunde, who was a wonderful performer, and Sammy was his god. And by the time we got around to doing this show, it was, because it had never occurred to me at the time I met Oba that I was going to do a show about Sammy. That didn't come till later. And he was wonderfully good. He could do all the things that Sammy could do, not quite as well, obviously, nobody could. But he was, by then, in his 50s. And we have to have Sammy in the middle of his period because he has to play younger and older to tell the story. So Sammy, the search went on, and finally, in the show that we're doing at the St. James is the man I want to play him in the show, and his name is Giles Terrera. And he even looks a bit like Sammy, but he's got the sort of that little extra something that took so long to find. Anyway, if we get the show put together, he will play it.
How lovely. Again, it gives you something else to think about in your life, doesn't it, really? Sort of watching this all take place before. What have you not done in your life?
Silence.
Do you think you've actually done everything?
Not everything, but I mean, Evie, my wife, and I, we have a very sort of wonderful routine. We have gathered together a lot of friends of all sorts, and they're mainly in the business. I even have a foreword in the book on name dropping, because I said, if I don't name drop, there is no book.
Yes.
And the people that I have met in the business have become close friends, and so that's what the book's about. I think there are more stories about other people than there are about me.
Yes.
That's why I call it a sort of biography.
Sort of biography.
As opposed to an autobiography.
And who would now be your best friend?
My best friend now, I guess, two people, Roger Moore and Michael Caine.
Right.
We grew up together. We've known each other all the years. Roger's coming to see the show tomorrow night.
Yes, he was on television this morning, I think, yes.
And Mike Caine is in New York doing a film with Morgan Freeman and Alan Arkin, which finishes the day after we open, so he won't be able to come the first night, but he'll see it the week after.
Amazing. It's a lovely collection of stories. It's a lovely collection of people. It's like a who's who of show business. I mean, it couldn't be any better. Leslie Bricusse's Pure Imagination, a sorter biography, is out now. Bless you. Thank you very much.
Bless your heart. Thank you.
It
very
all
intimate.
takes place. It's very, very intimate.
Yes.
It all takes place in the prison cell, and literally, I think the audience are going to feel like they're in the cell alongside us. They're going to see the sweat, a smell.